We're pleased to see so many people here. I thought last week was the middle Amana effect, because we had so many people there for the middle talk, but it looks like we got about the same number today, maybe a few shy. So we have two presentations today, one on Christian Metz and one on Amana in World War I, and kind of about pacifism generally. So without further ado, I'm Peter Hoehnle, for those of you who don't know me. And I helped Alan Duval bring his dissertation on Christian Metz to publication, and so that's kind of my connection to the whole Christian Metz story. We have a little bit of a technical snafu. It's always good to have the technical snafu on the very last presentations, not on the very first one, so I'll be leaning forward here to advance the slides as we go. So talking about Christian Metz, you're talking about arguably the major figure in inspirationist history in the 19th century. And he, of course, is leader of the organization for almost 50 years, and there's a lot of detail to that story. There are a lot of resources. There are hundreds of letters. There are almost 1,000 pages of diary entries. There are hundreds of poems to go through. He left a big paper trail behind him. So this is going to be a 4 or 5 hour presentation. No, I'm going to just be touching on the highlights. So if your favorite Christian Metz story isn't in here, bear with me. But I'm going to do kind of an overview of his life. As I mentioned, he was really the main driving force of the movement in the 19th century. But he was really more a reactive leader than he was a visionary leader. In other words, it's kind of funny to talk about somebody who was considered basically a prophet as being reactive. But he dealt with situations as they came up and came up with solutions using the advice of a lot of trusted elders around him. He didn't have any grand design or grand plan that we know of from the start. It's just that as the persecution started happening in Europe, he moved the people to the estates. That was a solution. When persecution continued and they thought about the New World, he gave the testimony that they should migrate to to the United States, and so on and so forth. So he's always coming up with solutions in concert with the other elders. So Christian Metz is born in Neuwied, Prussia, that we can say for certain, on December 30th, possibly in 1793. There's a little dispute about his birth date. In everything that he wrote and on his figuring his age at the time of his death on his gravestone, his date of birth should be December 30th, 1794. However, the Kirchenbuch in Neuwied records it as 1793. So he may have been a year older than he himself thought he was. But his family was an old inspirationist family. They were living in Neuwied. Those are two pictures of Neuwied. Neuwied had a thriving little inspirationist colony dating back to Paul Giesbert-Nagel, as we heard a few weeks ago. And the Metzes lived there. It's where all 7 of their children were born. From Neuwied, they moved to the Ronneburg Castle when Christian was 7 years old. This is a painting of the Ronneburg from about 1830. And this is where he grew up. About the age of 15 or thereabouts, he apprenticed to a carpenter at the Ronneburg, might have been Jakob Merschel, and learned the carpentry trade. And he seems to have been a carpenter as opposed to a cabinet maker. You don't see Christian Metz made pieces of furniture in Amana, but you do hear stories about him laying floors and doing more carpentry type work. As a youth, he trained as a carpenter. This is his license for actually operating a carpentry shop from 1836, and we'll talk more about this license because it included a physical description. And as a young man, he and several other young people at the Ronneburg became involved in the reawakening In 1816, in 1817, Michael Krausert comes to the Ronneberg, proclaiming that he is a new Werkzeug, and a youth group kind of coalesces around him, and Metz is a leader in that group. And Metz and others will travel with Krausert throughout the German states. Metz becomes kind of an aide to Krausert in a way. And in 1819, he himself became a Werkzeug. He delivered his first testimony, or I should say he wrote his first testimony. His first testimony was an Einsprache, which is a written statement. And all of the testimonies that he delivered for the first 9 or so years of his career as a Werkzeug were all written. Then he went through a period where he gave just spoken testimonies. Then he went through a period where he gave both spoken and written testimonies. And then in the final years of his life, he only gave spoken testimonies. But it goes in blocks. It goes in periods of time. Just a few statistics. He gave his first testimony on May the 3rd, 1819. And he gave another testimony in 1819. And then he came into a spiritual falling away. Part of that being because he failed to identify Krausert's weaknesses and turn on Krausert soon enough. And another is possibly his relationship with Charlotte Biesinger, which resulted in a baby. And so he did not give testimonies for a period of 4 years until 1823. And that year, in the entire year of 1823, he gave 8. That was the fewest testimonies that he ever gave in a year. I'm just going to give an overview of him as a Werkzeug right now at the beginning. The most testimonies he gave, I counted, was 164 in 1833. In 13 years, he delivered more than 100, and in 2 additional years, he gave 99. The average across his career as a Werkzeug was 81, which works out to 1 every 4.5 days, and sometimes several in one day. The median was 79, and the total was around 3,654, which puts him far ahead of the pack as far as a Werkzeug in delivering testimonies. He was also inspired longer than anybody else was. A total, if you use the 1823 starting point, of 44 years. Of the 3,654 testimonies that he gave, 207 have actually been translated and are in our testimony collection. So he became a Werkzeug. And after Michael Krausert fell away from the movement, and after Barbara Heinemann's marriage, he became the leading Werkzeug, the leader of the new Gemeinde, the new community. Not everyone accepted him as the leader. There were little pockets of opposition to him in different Inspirationist communities, but by and large, most of the Inspirationist communities eventually fell in line behind Christian Metz. He traveled broadly throughout Germany and then eventually into Switzerland, and eventually reinvigorated some of the almost forgotten Inspirationist communities, especially in Switzerland. This is supposedly his compass. There are a lot of Christian Metz relics, if you will, that have been passed down in different families, and this is supposed to have been his compass. There's a little string that would connect there, and then there's actually a little sundial attached to this as well. So he travels in Europe, and he eventually is able to get together quite a large following again. And of course, persecution starts again against several of the Inspirationist communities. And this is when Christian Metz gives the testimony that basically starts the road towards renting several large estates in the Hessen-Darmstadt area, starting with Marienborn in 1826, then Herrenhag in 1828, then Engeltal and Armenberg. And that's Armenberg. That's where he lived. It's actually called Arnsberg, but he renamed it in a testimony Armenberg, the place of the poor. And the building that the Inspirationists lived in is actually this part here. This is based on a family tradition in our family that my great-great-grandfather was born behind that window, right in the corner. So that's the building they occupied at the Armenberg. Again, the situation in the German states deteriorated, and Christian Metz delivered his famous testimony in August of 1842 that the Inspirationists should seek a new home in the West. And he wrote of this in his own history. Here now the Lord was revealing a way which seemed impossible to my flesh and to my nature, a way which he presented to me and also to the community in a testimony. It was now his holy will to lead the entire community, heretofore scattered in various locations a great distance away. My heart often trembled when considering such an extraordinary upheaval of all the congregations and their accommodations, which had cost all of us so much effort and money. All that everyone had was invested in this community, which was now just so barely begun. And that's a running theme in his writings, is these great upheavals, moving the people from Germany to New York State and then eventually to Iowa, and the cost and the price that the people were paying in order to make that transition. So he goes with a committee of 3 other elders to New York aboard the ship New York. That's the ship New York on the screen. It was a ship of the Black Ball packet line, hence the giant black ball painted on the sail. The ship was built in 1838, so it was fairly new when Christian Metz sailed on it. They made it across the ocean. There were several storms. He delivered 2 testimonies while on board the ship. They arrived in New York City, learned eventually of a tract of land near Buffalo, New York, and crossed the state on the Erie Canal, made it to Buffalo and set up shop in the Mansion House Hotel. And this is the Mansion House Hotel as it was in 1842. Actually found an engraving of the Mansion House from the year they were there. The gentleman, the incredibly handsome gentleman on the right there is my grandfather Wilhelm Noy, who was a thorn in Christian Metz's side for years and years and years. He is the only one of the first elders of Christian Metz's period that had his picture taken. He was a bit of a rebel. And when all the other elders held true to the idea of not having graven images made and having their portraits taken, he went out and had 2 of them done. So anyway, they went through the negotiations to buy what had been a portion of the Buffalo Creek Indian Reservation, about 5 miles from downtown Buffalo. They bought it from the Ogden Land Company, and they were a little bit unscrupulous. They actually didn't have full title to the land they were selling, so there was a lot of trouble. There was a lot of trouble with the Tonawanda Seneca. It was really a case where both the Seneca and the Inspirationists were being taken advantage of by the same land company. Ultimately, they were able to acquire the land. They named it Ebenezer, Christian Metz did. Again, taking that from the Bible, it means stone of help. Hitherto the Lord hath helped us. It says, Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, hitherto the Lord hath helped us. So they called it Ebenezer. They built eventually a total of 5 villages in New York State and 2 villages in Canada. There was Middle Ebenezer, Lower Ebenezer, Upper Ebenezer. Then they decided they needed a new community, so they called it New Ebenezer. Are you seeing a pattern here? And then there was Canada Ebenezer, because it was in Canada, and then there was Kenneburg. So think of Kenneburg as the homestead of the Ebenezer colonies, the only town to get a decent name. So anyway, Christian Metz, before the first group had even arrived, Christian Metz, George Weber, and Wilhelm Noy, and to some extent Gottlieb Ackermann, draft a preliminary constitution that sets up a temporary communal system. In other words, they would be communal for about 2 years while they were settling the property. The wealthy members advanced their money and so on. And it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, but once the members started arriving, they decided to make it permanent. This way, they thought, imitating the first Christian church, described in the book of Acts, where it talks about everything being held in common. It also made financial sense for them to pool the resources. Economies of scale being what they were, many hands made for light work, and a lot of money meant you could buy machinery, farm machinery and whatnot that you needed to get the villages up and running. And the same as the story of Middle Amana you heard last week. People who visited Ebenezer in 1846, 47, those early years, the first visitor accounts date from the 1840s, were amazed at what had been accomplished in just about 3 or 4 years by communal effort. I mean, these villages literally just sprang out of the ground and were established. And they had a fairly comfortable life. While they were there in Ebenezer, Christian Metz took on another role, which was that of a diarist and historian. He had kept diary-like notes in the 1830s already, and he kept a diary on the sea voyage, which is in the back of the Inspirations History, Volume 3, if you want to read it, translate it. But in 1846, he gives the famous testimony, "Behold the work of the old, let your heritage not be lost." And he took that to be his personal call to be sort of a community chronicler. So he started a diary, and that's one of the diary volumes there. That's actually one of his pencils. In living in this house in Ebenezer, he began to keep a community record. And he also wrote the historical description of the community history up to from 1817 to 1846 as he remembered it. And that was published in the 22nd Samuel. So that's another role that he takes on. Ebenezer was becoming crowded by buffalo. They wanted more land. They wanted affordable land. They wanted isolation. They were having difficulty with some of their neighbors. It's too much detail to go into. But eventually, Metz will give the testimony that they're to seek a home in the West. And so a committee is sent to look at Kansas. And this is Charles Journeycake, who is the Lenape or Delaware chief who showed them around Kansas. It was the absolute worst time to be looking at land in Kansas. It was in the middle of the Free State controversy where people were rushing into Kansas trying to pass a constitution that would make it a slave state. It was just a really, really bad time to be looking at land. They couldn't find a tract that they liked or that was really available, and so they came back to Ebenezer, and Christian Metz really came down hard on Carl Weber, the elder who had suggested Kansas. He sent a second committee to look at land in Iowa, and they, of course, eventually came to this area, came back to Ebenezer, and on Christmas Eve, 1854, Christian Metz declared in a testimony that this was the place that we should settle. And of course, in 1855, in June, the first elders came here to start buying the land. This, by the way, is Christian Metz's citizenship papers. I didn't know where to stick this in. This is just about the time that he actually became a citizen of the United States. This is his personal map of Amana. It's so early that it's still written Bleibtreu instead of Bleibtreu Amana there. Homestead is not on this map yet, so it was in a dark period for the community before Homestead came along. But what's really cool about this map, west is on here, but you can see the different farmhouses, and this reminds us that a lot of this land was already being farmed. There was very little government land. They bought all the government land in the township. It was 3,300 acres. About the only parcel of that government land that we still own today is the Lily Lake, because that was swampland. Nobody else wanted it. So this is early Amana in Christian Metz's map, but he kept track of the construction of the villages. And in 1856, he actually shows up on site. They had already built a house for him here, and he came here when there were just a few hundred people living in Amana. So he moved the locus of power, went wherever he was. And he came here, and there's a lot of correspondence back and forth between him and the other elders in Ebenezer. Of course, as you know, they sold Ebenezer. This is a sale poster for the Ebenezer land. And they made the move out to Iowa in about a 10-year time period. He had difficulties. Not everybody wanted to move. There was some hard feeling, especially from the elders in Lower Ebenezer, that this move was unnecessary. He once wrote in one of his letters, "I am an old soldier and could show you all my battle wounds." So don't get the impression that what Christian Metz said went all the time. When he was not inspired, he was technically just another elder and seems to have been treated that way. He didn't always get his way at first, but he, of course, was a tremendously persuasive person, and he also had the Word of God sometimes that he would issue to direct the community. During that move to Iowa, the Civil War erupted, and he spent quite a lot of time addressing the Civil War, both in his diary and through testimonies. I want to read that. One point wrote in his diary, "Oh, the suffering of this war is terrible now that the South has approached closer. Last night I saw 2 large bloodskins, both of which were overfull, and I heard a voice saying that when these 2 are full, then the highest officials will hear a powerful voice which no human strength can overcome. And then I saw the invasion of the North in a dream in the following night." He's always having dreams. He'll dream about people dying and worry about their health then. He'll have dreams about the events of the Civil War, and he's often right. The dreams do kind of foretell the future. And he records those in his diary. This is the house that he lived in. Many of you will know it as the Jody Mattis house, Easterly's house. It's just around the corner here. He lived in the basement. He may have had diabetes based on the symptoms that are recorded. He had just a room down in the cellar. The upstairs was a kitchen house managed by Barbara Dorr, who more or less acted as his housekeeper. His daughter and her family lived with him, and everybody knew that she was his daughter. He had had that relationship with Charlotte Biesinger in 1819. He always raised the daughter. The daughter was always in his household. Charlotte Biesinger kind of went off on her own way. Christian Metz decided that his role was as leader of the community and as a celibate, and so marriage was out of the question. Earlier, they had tried to get married because of his activities as a dissident religious leader. The authorities have refused him a license. So the story goes. So anyway, this is his house. That's his chair, another relic that survives. And he settled into life here in Amana, but it wasn't a totally peaceful life because he was forever going back and forth to Ebenezer. He made something like 9 different trips back when that was a big deal. It took several days by train and by steamship to get to and from New York State, but he felt it was important to be on site to direct both the building of Amana and the liquidation of Ebenezer, which of course finally happened in 1864. Two more Metz items. They're hard to see. This is his cap. Again, there's this thing where they saved these relics of Christian Metz in the family. This passed down through one of the Miller lines. There's a whole box. It has his pill bottles, his snuff box, piece of wood from the bed he died in, and his cap. That's his desk over there on the right. And it was there that he kept his diary and his records up until the time he died on the 24th of July in 1867. Here we have a physical description of Christian Metz that's included with his license to operate a carpentry shop. There's also a physical description of him on his Reisepass, his passport, when leaving Germany, and also some older folks that Louise Duval interviewed in the 1940s remembered him still. And he looked nothing like you thought. He supposedly had long, straight brown hair, a beard, brown beard in earlier life, an oval face, stood about a little over 5 feet tall, had noticeably short legs, and was very broad, although not fat. So that's the description of Christian Metz, kind of a little guy with short legs. So not this tall, commanding, patriarch-like figure that you might imagine. So let's see. Got to get here. So, of course, he died on the 24th of July, 1867, after an extended illness. He was buried in the Amana Cemetery. There is a space, an extra space between his grave and the next grave in the row. Some people have started the tradition that that was a special mark of honor given to him. I think it was an accident because in the early 1960s, they leveled the entire cemetery. They took all the markers out. They drove a metal pipe on Christian Metz's grave, so his grave marker would be in exactly the right place. And they straightened out the rows, which had never been that even to begin with. And I think that in straightening out the row, they just wound up with an extra space there. But that's just my story. Because it's not mentioned until after the 1960s. So what's his legacy? Well, we're his legacy, obviously. The Amana community is his legacy. The church is his legacy. 42 volumes of testimonies, 3,600 testimonies all told, 950-page diary, if you ever want to read it. It's actually quite entertaining. It has been translated, manuscript translation. He does come off pretty good in the diary. He really does sincerely come off as a very humble person who didn't always, he wasn't a domineering personality. He really will have self-doubt in his diary. There's one passage where he delivered a testimony directed to a man and then found out that the man had died before the testimony was issued, and he just goes into this whole frenzy of, why did I do this? Why was I issuing this word? He really, when you talk about inspiration and the sincerity of it, there's nothing in anything that he wrote, there's nothing in any of the letters that indicate that anything but that he was inspired and that he believed that he really was delivering the word of God to the people when he spoke. So he was a well-liked figure. They talk about him being especially good with young children. There is a story that once during a church service, he was admonishing some of the youth for misbehaving, and then looked out in the congregation, looked over the rim of his glasses and said, "Oh, I believe they're not even here." So, and that's a point. That's a point, because not all of the Werkzeug or the leaders are remembered that way. A lot of them were remembered as being very strong dictatorial and very strict, and not so Christian Metz. He just seems to have been kind of an average man. As Abraham Lincoln said, I do not claim to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me, and that could be said about Christian Metz. Events happened to him, and he dealt with them. And he was a person who did not think so well of himself that he was afraid to ask friends and associates for their advice and to follow it when it was reasonably good advice. In his diary, you'll also read that he had a good sense of human nature and really how to deal with people and how to kind of finesse a situation so that somebody could be admonished and called to task for bad behavior, but not alienated, not felt that they would have to leave the community. He did have enemies. He did have people who rejected his leadership. Of course, during his lifetime, hundreds of people came in and left the community at different points, but by and large, there's an affectionate memory of Christian Metz, which cannot be said of all the leaders, and I'm not mentioning names. So if you want to read more about him, and I don't know why you would after I've droned on for so long, apologies about that, there is his Tagebuch, which is in German, but also, as I said, has been translated. We have basically a complete diary now from 1842 to 1866 when he stopped writing. And then the biography, which we have copies of here, which if you want, you just pick up a copy of that. That's Alan Duval's dissertation. The dissertation was about twice as long as the book is, so we cut out a lot of things in order to make a readable book. So that's that. Do you have any questions?
Peter, where's the manuscript for the English of his diary? Like, where is that from?
I'm working on it, so if anybody wants it, I can email it to you.
But it's not like on that testimony
No. So basically what we've been doing is putting it together. Mm-hmm. So we've got Janet's fine translation of the Sea Voyage Diary, then Lainey Shear did a chunk, then Polly Zimmerman did a chunk, and then John did a chunk. And it's far from being done because the translations are not all quite complete. The other thing is that there's so much poetry in there. There are 200, almost 300 poems rather, that he wrote in just 10 years between 1845 and 1855. And a lot of those poems are 15 or 20 stanzas, and they're not great poetry always. Some of them are. We all know Ich glaube an dich, I trust in thee. And several others that became part of the 8th edition of the Sauerspiel. But what I've been doing as I've been editing this is indicating where the poems are, and then basically saying if you want to read the poem, read it in the original German, because it's so hard to translate poetry and it's never right. So, yes, sir.
Could you get into the reasons why the community felt persecuted or were enough to have to leave Ebenezer?
Oh boy. The main thing with that, first of all, with Ebenezer, the starting out with the whole purchase being such a convoluted affair and a difficult deal seems to have left a bad feeling in the minds of the leaders. And the main thing that had happened was that there was a Buffalo Hydraulic Association. They had a dam on Buffalo Creek. They had built this dam to divert water into an industrial canal leading into Buffalo. This backed up the water to the Ebenezer mills and just basically stopped our mills from functioning. And we raised a legal ruckus and tried to seek an injunction against them. That was not going well. They did want more land. They had about 7,700 acres by this point in time, but it wasn't enough. When it came to Iowa, they bought 26,000, and the land values had gone up in that area considerably. So there was that. The other thing is that Buffalo had a large German population. And that had grown exponentially in the 1840s and 1850s. So there's all these Germans 6 miles away, and they're having their continental Sundays and beer drinking, and they're making money and living lives that are not as restricted as the folks were in Ebenezer, and they felt that this was a bad influence on the young people. And then finally, and this is the one I find hard to comprehend, but there was a railroad that was going to be built across the property. And they weren't really thrilled about this railroad because evidently it was just going to bisect the property and they weren't going to get a station out of it. And so all that compounded led to feeling that maybe the west was the place to go. And then, of course, he gives the testimony to go west.
And I would add, there was still always trouble with the Indians,
Yeah,
the Native
yeah.
Americans, and that persisted. And there was the feeling that they believed that eventually they would get the land back, which was,
Yeah.
now doesn't sound all that unreasonable, I guess, but it was difficult to deal with.
It's now suburban Buffalo. There are about 50 buildings still standing from Ebenezer days, but you need a map to find them. They're all built over and remodeled and so on. Cool, we good? Yes, sir.
Who paid him? I mean, he basically worked for the community.
Yes.
His travels, even his travels in Germany, how did he fund it? Or did he just
That's a very good question. It's, as far as I know, it's never said. There are stories about, there is a story about a person giving him money, and certainly there were wealthier members of the community who were his traveling partners who may have been paying the way for both of them. He himself did not have a whole lot of money at the time of the community. You know, we do have the record book that shows who put what into the community, and he put in $292, which, you know, it's $4,000 or $5,000, maybe a little bit more in today's money. It's not much. That's a good question. There's really no solid answer I can give you.
follow up on that? Coming to the back here, I just looked at my genealogy breakdown of his dependents, and I see probably 200 or more, most of which are not living in the Amanas.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the interesting thing with the Metz children. There are 7 in that family. One of them dies as a child. None of his siblings ever married. There are no nieces or nephews. Everybody comes down through Anna Marie, his Amy. He called her Amy, his daughter. Everybody comes through her. Cool. Are we good? Okay. Well.